Tom Hayes sat hunched in the emergency room's plastic chair at 2 a.m., clutching a weathered watercolor box like a lifeline, while his 7-year-old daughter Grace lay unconscious beyond those sterile double doors. 18 months of fumbling through single parenthood had carved hollow circles under his eyes, and tonight's fever-induced seizure had shattered what little composure he had left. The fluorescent lights hummed their merciless tune while other families whispered prayers he'd stopped believing in after Anna died. Then a woman materialized in the seat beside him, expensive clothes masquerading as ordinary fabric, manicured hands trembling around a wedding ring worn thin by grief. She studied his paint box with an intimacy that made his breath catch, her red-rimmed eyes holding secrets that seemed to pierce straight through him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking with something between sympathy and recognition. "But that box, those aren't just any watercolors, are they?" The question hung in the antiseptic air like smoke, and Tom realized this stranger somehow knew exactly what he was holding. Tom's fingers tightened around the familiar wooden edges, the same way they had every night for 18 months when the memories became too heavy to carry alone. Anna's voice echoed in his mind from their last conversation in this very hospital, her weakened hand pointing to the paint box on the bedside table. "Promise me you'll keep creating, Tom. Promise me you won't let Grace forget that beauty exists even when everything feels broken." He'd failed at both promises, spending his days teaching other people's children about art, while his own daughter grew up believing creativity died with her mother. The stranger beside him shifted slightly, and Tom caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something else, the same antiseptic smell that clung to everyone who'd spent too many hours in places like this. Her fingers worried the thin gold band on her ring finger, spinning it in slow, methodical circles that spoke of practiced grief. "My name is Maggie," she said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. "And I have a feeling we've been carrying similar burdens." The way she said it made Tom's chest tighten with recognition he couldn't explain. Before he could respond, a doctor in rumpled scrubs pushed through the double doors, clipboard in hand and exhaustion written across his face like a signature. "Mr. Hayes?" Tom bolted upright, the paint box nearly slipping from his grip as every nerve in his body went electric with anticipation. "Grace is stable. The fever broke about 20 minutes ago, and she's asking for you." The relief hit him like a physical blow, 18 months of accumulated terror pouring out of him in a shaky exhale that bordered on a sob. Maggie's hand found his shoulder, a gentle pressure that steadied him without being intrusive. "Go to her," she whispered, but there was something in her voice that made him pause. When he looked back, she was already standing, gathering a purse that probably cost more than his monthly salary. "Wait," he called out, suddenly desperate not to lose this strange connection. "How did you know about the paint box?" But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. At the exit she turned back once, and Tom swore he saw tears reflecting the harsh hospital lights. The doctor cleared his throat impatiently, and Tom forced himself to follow the man through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Grace looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped reassuringly now, but had been silent warnings just hours before. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and she reached for the paint box with the same instinctive gesture Anna used to make. "Daddy, I dreamed about Mommy," she whispered, her voice still hoarse from the fever. "She said a nice lady was going to help us paint again." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach as he remembered the stranger's knowing look, but he pushed the feeling aside and focused on his daughter's recovery. 3 days later, Tom stood in line at Miller's coffee shop, Grace's small hand tucked safely in his as they waited to order her favorite hot chocolate. The art teacher's salary barely covered their expenses, but treating Grace to small luxuries felt like the only way he could prove he was more than just a man treading water in grief. The barista, a college kid with paint-stained fingers that reminded Tom of his younger self, smiled at Grace's elaborate order involving extra marshmallows and whipped cream shaped like a cat. "I've got this," a familiar voice said from behind them, and Tom turned to find Maggie standing there with a $20 bill already extended toward the register. She looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more human, though her clothes still whispered of wealth, even as she tried to dress down in jeans and a simple sweater. Grace stared up at her with the unguarded curiosity of childhood, tilting her head like a bird examining something particularly interesting. Tom's pride flared immediately, the same defensive reaction that had kept him isolated from well-meaning neighbors and concerned relatives for the past year and a half. "Thanks, but we're fine," he said, pulling out his own wallet with perhaps more force than necessary. Maggie's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in her eyes that looked like understanding rather than offense. "Of course you are," she replied, stepping back with her hands raised in gentle surrender. "I just remember what it's like to stand in line and count dollars twice." The admission caught him off guard, especially coming from someone whose handbag probably cost more than his car. Grace tugged on his sleeve with the persistence of a child who'd spotted something important that adults were too distracted to notice. "Daddy, she has the same sad eyes as you do," she announced with the brutal honesty that 7-year-olds wielded like tiny, truth-seeking missiles. Both adults froze, caught in the crossfire of childhood observation that cut deeper than any adult conversation could manage. Maggie crouched down to Grace's level, bringing herself eye to eye with the little girl who'd just diagnosed 2 strangers with surgical precision. "You're very observant," Maggie said softly, her voice carrying the kind of gentle respect that children recognized immediately. "What else do you see?" Grace considered this seriously, her head tilting the other way as she studied Maggie's face with the intensity of a young artist learning to see details others missed. "You miss someone too," Grace said finally, "and you're lonely like Daddy gets sometimes when he thinks I'm sleeping." Tom felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment, but Maggie simply nodded as if Grace had shared the most reasonable observation in the world. The barista cleared his throat, and Tom realized they'd been holding up the line while his daughter conducted an impromptu therapy session with a stranger. He paid for their order quickly, mumbling apologies to the people behind them, but Maggie fell into step beside them as they moved toward a corner table. "Would you mind if I joined you?" she asked, and Tom found himself nodding before his brain could form a proper response. Something about her presence felt both dangerous and necessary, like standing too close to a fire when you've been cold for too long. Grace chattered happily about her recovery, her fever dreams, and her plans to paint a picture of the nice hospital doctor who'd given her a sticker shaped like a rainbow. Tom found himself relaxing despite his better judgment, watching Maggie listen to his daughter with the kind of focused attention that had become rare in his world. Most adults nodded politely at children while clearly thinking about other things, but Maggie asked follow-up questions and remembered details that Grace mentioned casually. When Grace announced her intention to become a doctor artist who painted pictures to help sick people feel better, Maggie's eyes lit up with genuine delight. "That sounds like the most important job in the world," Maggie said, and Tom could tell she meant it. "Your mummy would be so proud of that dream." The casual mention of Anna should have felt intrusive, but somehow it didn't. Instead, Tom found himself studying Maggie's face for clues about how she knew to say exactly the right thing. Grace beamed and launched into a detailed explanation of how doctor artists would work, complete with hand gestures that knocked over her empty hot chocolate cup. As Tom moved to clean up the mess, Maggie's hand briefly covered his, and he felt calluses on her fingers that didn't match her polished appearance. When they finally parted ways in the coffee shop parking lot, Grace insisted on giving Maggie a hug that lasted longer than most adult handshakes. "Will we see you again?" Grace asked with the direct simplicity that adults spent years learning to complicate. Maggie glanced at Tom, and he found himself hoping she'd say yes, even as his rational mind warned him about getting involved with someone who clearly had secrets. "I'd like that very much," Maggie replied, ruffling Grace's hair in a gesture so natural it looked practiced. As they drove away, Tom caught sight of Maggie in his rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot with an expression he couldn't quite read. Over the following weeks, these chance encounters became a pattern that felt both random and inevitable. Maggie appeared at the playground where Tom took Grace on Saturday mornings, always with a plausible excuse. She was meeting a friend, she liked to walk in the park. She'd just finished a charity meeting at the community center. Grace gravitated toward her with the magnetic pull of a child who'd been starved for female attention, and Tom found himself looking forward to these meetings, despite his lingering suspicions about their frequency. The third Saturday, Maggie brought a small set of watercolors, the same brand Anna had always preferred, though Tom tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence. Grace's eyes went wide with delight, and she immediately wanted to paint the duck pond while sitting cross-legged on the grass beside Maggie. Tom watched from a nearby bench as Maggie guided Grace through mixing colors, her instructions gentle but precise. "Your daddy taught you well," Maggie said at one point, and Grace shook her head with characteristic honesty. "Daddy doesn't paint anymore," Grace explained matter-of-factly, holding up her brush to examine the purple she'd created by mixing red and blue. "He says the colors went away when Mommy died, but I think they're just hiding and scared to come out." Tom felt something twist in his chest at his daughter's assessment, partly because it was heartbreakingly accurate, and partly because he'd never realized how much Grace had been watching and understanding. Maggie glanced over at him with an expression that managed to convey sympathy without pity, and Tom had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing straight through all his carefully constructed defenses. When Grace ran off to chase a particularly bold squirrel, Tom found himself alone on the bench with Maggie for the first time since that night in the emergency room. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but charged with unspoken questions. "You don't have to keep showing up," he said finally, not sure if he was offering her an escape route or testing her commitment. "Grace gets attached easily, and I don't want her to get hurt if you decide this was just a phase." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but Maggie didn't flinch. "Is that what you think this is?" she asked quietly, her eyes following Grace's progress around the pond. "A phase?" There was something vulnerable in her voice that made Tom look at her more carefully. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way her hands never quite stopped moving, as if stillness invited thoughts she wasn't ready to face. "I think you're someone with money and time who feels sorry for the struggling single dad," he said, immediately hating himself for the cruelty, even as the words left his mouth. Maggie was quiet for so long that Tom began to think he'd finally succeeded in driving her away. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband died 3 years ago," she said, still watching Grace instead of looking at him. "Heart attack at 45, right in our kitchen while I was upstairs getting ready for another charity gala that seemed so important at the time." She paused, and Tom could see her throat working as she swallowed hard. "We kept saying we'd have children after he got the business established, after we traveled more, after we had enough money to do it right. There was always going to be more time." The confession hung in the air between them, like a bridge Tom wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Grace's laughter carried across the pond as she succeeded in getting close enough to feed the ducks some breadcrumbs from her pocket, and both adults watched her with the kind of intense focus that comes from recognizing how precious and fragile happiness can be. "I'm sorry," Tom said finally, the inadequate words feeling heavy on his tongue. "I didn't know." Maggie shrugged, but there was nothing casual about the gesture. "How could you?" she replied, finally turning to meet his eyes. "I don't talk about it much. People either want to fix it or they get uncomfortable and change the subject." She gestured toward Grace, who was now attempting to teach the ducks to follow her in a straight line. "But watching her, it's the first time in 3 years that I've felt like maybe there's still something beautiful in the world worth protecting." The honesty in her voice made Tom's chest tight with recognition, and he realized that somewhere in the past few weeks, his suspicion had quietly transformed into something that felt dangerously close to trust. That evening, as Tom tucked Grace into bed, she surprised him by asking about Maggie, with the kind of serious curiosity she usually reserved for questions about death and God, and why some people had more money than others. "Do you think Maggie is lonely like us?" she asked, her small hand playing with the edge of her blanket in a gesture that reminded Tom painfully of Anna. "I think maybe she needs a family too." The observation was so astute it took Tom's breath away, and he found himself wondering when his 7-year-old had become so wise about the complexities of adult emotional landscapes. "Maybe she does," he admitted, sitting on the edge of her bed and smoothing her dark hair away from her face. "But you know families can't just be put together like puzzles, right? Sometimes people need different things, or they're not ready, or—" He trailed off, realizing he was trying to explain concepts he wasn't sure he understood himself. Grace nodded solemnly, but her next words proved she'd grasped something he was still struggling with. "Mommy used to say that love isn't about being ready," Grace said, her voice growing sleepy but determined. "It's about being brave enough to try again even when you're scared." Tom felt his throat constrict as he recognized Anna's words coming from their daughter's mouth, carrying wisdom he'd been too afraid to hear when his wife was still alive to say them. He kissed Grace's forehead and turned off her light, but her words followed him into his own sleepless night, like gentle ghosts refusing to be ignored. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon when Tom received a call from Grace's school that made his hands shake as he fumbled for his car keys. Grace had collapsed during recess, and while she was conscious and talking, the school nurse insisted he come immediately. Tom's mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios, 18 months of single-parent anxiety crystallizing into pure terror as he drove through traffic that seemed deliberately designed to test his sanity. He burst into the school nurse's office to find Grace sitting on the examination table, pale but alert, with Maggie sitting beside her holding her hand. Tom's relief at seeing Grace okay was immediately followed by confusion about how Maggie had gotten there first. "I was volunteering in the library," Maggie explained quickly, reading the question in his eyes. "Mrs. Peterson couldn't reach you right away, so she called the emergency contacts, and I was here when Grace asked for me." The explanation made sense, but something about it felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. Grace reached for him with both arms, and Tom gathered her against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and the faint smell of classroom chalk that always clung to her clothes. "I got dizzy and everything went sparkly," she explained, matter-of-factly, as if this was a perfectly reasonable thing to happen on a Tuesday afternoon. "But Maggie came and held my hand until you got here, just like Mommy used to do when I had nightmares." The comparison should have felt wrong, but instead it settled something in Tom's chest that had been restless for months. The pediatrician they saw that afternoon diagnosed Grace with a mild case of low blood sugar, complicated by the growth spurt she'd been experiencing, prescribing more frequent meals and less worry for everyone involved. But as they sat in the waiting room afterward, Tom found himself studying Maggie with new eyes, trying to reconcile the wealthy woman who could afford to volunteer her time with the person who'd known exactly how to comfort his daughter. "How did you know what to do?" he asked finally, genuine curiosity overriding his usual defensiveness. "I spent a lot of time in hospitals the last year of my husband's life," Maggie replied, her voice carefully neutral. "You learn things." She was quiet for a moment, watching Grace color in a princess coloring book she'd found in the waiting room toy box. "And I had a lot of practice imagining what it would be like to comfort a child through scary things." The admission was so quietly heartbreaking that Tom felt his protective walls crumble a little more, leaving him exposed to feelings he'd been trying to avoid since Anna died. That night, after Grace was safely asleep with strict instructions to wake him if she felt dizzy again, Tom found himself standing in the kitchen, staring at his phone with Maggie's number displayed on the screen. She'd written it on a piece of paper torn from Grace's coloring book, her handwriting neat and careful, like someone who'd been taught that presentation mattered. He wanted to call and thank her properly, to apologize for his suspicions, to ask her about the volunteer work she did, and the life she'd built after losing everything that mattered. Instead, he found himself typing and deleting text messages that never seemed to capture what he was trying to say. How do you thank someone for showing up without being asked? How do you acknowledge that their presence has become necessary without admitting that you're falling for someone you barely know? In the end, he settled for something simple. "Thank you for being there today. Grace hasn't stopped talking about how safe you made her feel." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then immediately wondered if he'd said too much or too little. Her response came quickly enough that he knew she'd been waiting for him to reach out. "Thank you for letting me help. It meant more to me than you know." The message was followed by another one a few seconds later. "Grace is lucky to have a father who loves her so much. Anna would be proud." The casual mention of his wife's name should have felt jarring, but instead it felt like a gift, someone else who understood that grief didn't mean forgetting, that loving again didn't diminish what came before. Tom stared at the messages until the screen went dark, then read them again, trying to decode the layers of meaning hidden in simple words. There was something about the way Maggie wrote Anna's name, with familiarity rather than the careful distance most people used when mentioning the dead. It was a small detail, barely noticeable, but it planted a seed of curiosity that would grow in the weeks to come. For now, though, he was content to focus on the warmth spreading through his chest at the realization that someone cared enough to wait for his call. The weeks that followed developed a rhythm that felt both natural and surreal. Maggie began joining them for dinner on Sunday nights, bringing groceries she claimed were about to expire from some charity event or another. She helped Grace with art projects that grew increasingly ambitious, teaching her techniques that Tom recognized from his own training, but had somehow never thought to share with his daughter. She listened to Grace's endless stories about school and friends and dreams, with the kind of patient attention that Tom remembered Anna giving, but different somehow, like someone learning to love rather than someone who'd always known how. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Grace bloomed under Maggie's attention, her art growing more confident and expressive with each passing week. Tom found himself laughing more than he had since Anna died, caught up in conversations that ranged from Grace's latest theories about why teachers assigned homework to Maggie's surprisingly sharp observations about local politics. But underneath the domesticity, Tom noticed details that didn't quite add up to the story Maggie had told him about her simple life as a charity volunteer. Her clothes were expensive even when she tried to dress down, and she had a way of handling money that spoke of someone who'd never had to count change or worry about overdraft fees. She knew things about art and literature that suggested an education far beyond what most people could afford, and her references to travel were casual but extensive. Most telling of all, she never seemed to go to work despite claiming to run a small charity foundation, and her availability during school hours suggested a flexibility that didn't match the demands of non-profit management. The contradiction that bothered Tom most was how she knew exactly what Grace needed, before Grace herself realized she needed it. When Grace mentioned wanting to try oil paints like the famous artists in her library books, Maggie showed up the next week with a complete set of child-safe oils and canvas boards. When Grace complained about nightmares, Maggie taught her a technique for lucid dreaming that worked so well Grace started looking forward to sleep. It was as if Maggie had been preparing for Grace's needs long before she'd met her, and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their story than random encounters in emergency rooms. The revelation came on a rainy Saturday afternoon when Grace discovered a photograph that had fallen out of Maggie's purse while she was searching for tissues. Tom was in the kitchen making hot chocolate when he heard Grace's sharp intake of breath, followed by the kind of silence that usually meant trouble. He found them in the living room, Grace holding a photo with the careful reverence she usually reserved for pictures of Anna, while Maggie sat frozen on the couch with an expression that looked like she'd been caught stealing. "This is Mommy," Grace said, but her voice was confused rather than excited. "But she's in a hospital bed, and there's a lady with her I don't know." Tom took the photograph from Grace's hands, and his world shifted sideways as he recognized Anna's face, thin and pale from chemotherapy but smiling at the camera. Beside her in the hospital bed, holding Anna's hand with obvious affection, was a younger version of Maggie, her hair longer and her face softer, but unmistakably the same person who'd been sharing their Sunday dinners for the past 2 months. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and Grace's confused breathing as she looked back and forth between the adults who'd suddenly become strangers. Tom's hands shook as he studied the photo, trying to reconcile the evidence in front of him with the story Maggie had told about chance meetings and random kindness. Anna looked happy in the picture, genuinely happy in a way Tom remembered from their early days together. And Maggie looked at her with an expression of such clear affection that Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You knew her," Tom said finally, his voice coming out flat and dangerous in a way that made Grace press closer to his side. "You knew Anna before she died." It wasn't a question, and Maggie's face crumpled slightly as she nodded. The confirmation hit Tom like a physical blow, rewriting every interaction they'd had over the past few months, transforming trust into betrayal and warmth into calculation. "How long?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. 2 years, Maggie whispered, her voice so quiet Tom had to strain to hear it. "I met her when she reached out to my foundation for help with medical bills. We became close, very close." She looked at Grace, who was watching the conversation with the wide-eyed attention of a child, trying to understand adult complexities that were beyond her comprehension. "Anna talked about both of you constantly. She was so worried about what would happen after." Maggie's voice broke, and Tom saw tears spilling down her cheeks that looked genuine despite everything else that had been fake. Tom felt like he was drowning in questions and accusations, but Grace's presence beside him forced him to maintain some semblance of control. "So all of this," he said, gesturing around the living room that had become their shared space. "The coffee shop, the park, the school emergency. It was all planned?" The words tasted bitter in his mouth, and he saw Maggie flinch as if he'd struck her. Part of him was glad she was hurting, and part of him hated himself for feeling that way. "Not all of it," Maggie said quickly, desperately. "Tom, I need you to understand. Anna asked me to watch over you and Grace if something happened to her. She was so afraid you'd both be alone, that you'd stop painting, that Grace would grow up thinking love was something that only ended in loss." She reached toward him as if to touch his arm, then stopped when she saw the way he recoiled. "But everything I felt for both of you, every moment we shared, that was real. That was never part of any plan." Grace tugged on Tom's sleeve with increasing urgency, her 7-year-old brain working overtime to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about the adults in her life. "Daddy," she said in a small voice that broke Tom's heart, "does this mean Maggie was Mommy's friend? Does this mean Mommy sent her to take care of us like she promised she would?" The innocent question hit Tom like a sledgehammer, forcing him to confront the possibility that his wife had orchestrated their healing from beyond the grave. The idea should have been comforting, but instead it filled Tom with a rage that surprised him with its intensity. How dare Anna make decisions about his future without consulting him? How dare she decide that he and Grace needed to be fixed, that their grief wasn't sufficient, that they required management from a stranger who'd been watching them like subjects in some elaborate social experiment? And how dare Maggie accept that role, inserting herself into their lives under false pretenses and making them care about her when caring had already cost them everything once before? "I need you to leave," Tom said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I need you to take your photo and your lies and your charity project, and I need you to leave us alone." Maggie's face went white, but she didn't argue or plead or try to explain further. Instead, she gathered her purse with shaking hands, kissed the top of Grace's head so gently it looked like a benediction, and walked toward the door with the kind of dignity that comes from practice in losing things that matter. "Tom," she said quietly, pausing with her hand on the doorknob, "Anna loved you more than anything in this world. Everything she did, everything she asked me to do. It was because she couldn't bear the thought of you giving up on happiness." She looked back at Grace, who was crying silently in a way that suggested she understood more than any child should have to. "And for what it's worth, these past few months have been the happiest I've been since my husband died. That wasn't charity or obligation. That was love, whether you believe it or not." The door closed behind her with a quiet click that seemed to echo through the house long after she was gone. Grace looked up at Tom with red-rimmed eyes that held a disappointment he'd never seen there before, and he realized that in protecting them from deception, he might have destroyed something precious that couldn't be rebuilt. "Daddy," Grace whispered, "I think you made a mistake." But Tom was already walking away, unable to bear the weight of his daughter's judgment on top of everything else that had just shattered around him. The following weeks passed in a haze of routine and regret that felt familiar from the early days after Anna's death. Tom threw himself into teaching with manic energy, staying late to grade papers and prepare lessons that didn't really need his attention. Grace grew quiet and withdrawn, her artwork taking on darker themes that worried her school counselor and broke Tom's heart in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. She asked about Maggie constantly at first, then stopped asking when it became clear that mentioning her name made Tom's face go hard in a way that scared her. At night, when Grace was asleep, and the house felt too empty to navigate safely, Tom found himself staring at the photograph that had started everything. He'd tried to throw it away a dozen times, but something always stopped him at the last moment. Anna looked so happy in the picture, genuinely joyful in a way he'd almost forgotten she could be. And Maggie looked at her with such obvious love that Tom had to acknowledge, grudgingly, that whatever else had been false about their relationship, her grief over losing Anna was completely real. The more he studied the photo, the more details he noticed that complicated his narrative of betrayal and manipulation. Anna was wearing the silver bracelet Tom had given her for their 5th anniversary, the one she'd claimed was her favorite piece of jewelry, even though he'd bought it at a discount store because money was tight that year. Maggie was wearing scrubs that suggested she'd been at the hospital in some professional capacity, not just as a visitor. There were medical charts visible in the background, and both women looked comfortable with their surroundings in a way that spoke of spending significant time together in that environment. Tom realized, with growing discomfort, that he'd never really asked Anna about the details of her treatment or the people who'd helped her through the darkest period of her life. He'd been so focused on being strong for her and for Grace that he'd missed or ignored the network of support she'd built around herself. The foundation Maggie had mentioned, the medical bills Anna had struggled with, the fear about their future that had driven her to reach out for help from strangers, all of it had happened while Tom was trying to hold their family together through sheer force of will. The truth, when it finally settled into his consciousness like sediment in still water, was more complex than the simple story of deception he'd been telling himself. Anna had reached out to Maggie's foundation because they needed help, and somewhere in that professional relationship, two women facing loss had found friendship and mutual support. Anna had asked Maggie to check on her family, not because she thought Tom was incompetent, but because she understood that grief could be isolating and that healing sometimes required help from people who'd walked similar paths. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Tom received a call from Grace's school that felt like déjà vu in the worst possible way. Grace had collapsed again, this time during art class while working on a painting that her teacher described as unusually emotional for a child her age. Tom arrived at the nurse's office to find Grace conscious but listless, staring at the ceiling with the kind of vacant expression he remembered from the weeks immediately following Anna's death. She's been asking for Maggie," the nurse said quietly, pulling Tom aside while Grace pretended not to listen. "She keeps saying that Maggie would know what to do, that Maggie understands about missing people." The words hit Tom like accusations, forced him to confront the possibility that his attempt to protect Grace from deception had actually deprived her of something she desperately needed. He looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw the same hollow expression he'd been wearing for 18 months before Maggie had appeared in their lives. That night, after the pediatrician had once again diagnosed stress and prescribed more attention to Grace's emotional needs, Tom sat on the edge of his daughter's bed and tried to find words for conversations he'd been avoiding. "Grace," he said carefully, "I want you to know that I'm sorry about what happened with Maggie. I was angry and scared, and I made some choices that hurt you." Grace turned to look at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 7-year-old face, and Tom realized that his attempt to shield her from adult complexities had instead forced her to grapple with them alone. "Do you think Maggie still loves us?" Grace asked, her voice small and careful in a way that suggested she'd been thinking about this question for weeks. "Or do you think we made her too sad to want to see us anymore?" The possibility that his actions had hurt Maggie hadn't occurred to Tom in any meaningful way, but hearing it from Grace's perspective forced him to consider the human cost of his righteous anger. He thought about the expression on Maggie's face when she'd left, the careful dignity that had looked like someone practicing how to lose gracefully. "I think," Tom said slowly, choosing his words with the kind of care usually reserved for diffusing bombs, "that Maggie loves us very much, and that she's probably as sad about what happened as we are." Grace nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "But Daddy," she said, "if we all miss each other, why can't we just say we're sorry and be a family again?" The question was so fundamentally reasonable that Tom felt ashamed of all the adult complications he'd layered on top of something that could be, at its core, very simple. The next morning, Tom did something he hadn't done since Anna died. He called in sick to work and spent the day driving around Millbrook, trying to work up the courage to do what Grace's wisdom had made clear was necessary. He found himself parked outside the coffee shop where he and Maggie had first talked, then driving past the park where she'd taught Grace to paint, then sitting in the hospital parking lot where everything had started. Each location held memories that felt both precious and painful, reminders of a happiness he'd thrown away in a moment of fear and pride. Finally, as the sun was setting and his courage was threatening to abandon him entirely, Tom drove to the address he'd found for Maggie's foundation. The building was modest but well-maintained, with large windows that let in natural light and a sign that read, "Whitfield Foundation for Medical Support." Tom sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching people come and go, trying to reconcile this tangible evidence of Maggie's work with his assumptions about her motivations and methods. A security guard eventually approached his car to ask if he needed assistance, and Tom realized that sitting in a parking lot staring at a building probably looked suspicious to outside observers. "I'm looking for Margaret Whitfield," he said, feeling foolish and desperate in equal measure. "I need to apologize to her for something." The guard, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the patience of someone who'd dealt with his share of human drama, smiled and pointed toward the main entrance. "She usually works late on Thursdays," he said. "Just tell the receptionist you're here to see her, and she'll let you know if Ms. Whitfield is available." Tom thanked him and walked toward the building on unsteady legs, carrying with him a speech he'd rehearsed a dozen times and a hope that felt fragile enough to shatter at the first sign of rejection. The receptionist, a young woman with purple hair and paint-stained fingers that reminded Tom of his students, looked up from her computer with a welcoming smile. "Tom Hayes," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "I need to speak with Margaret Whitfield if she's available. It's personal." The receptionist's expression shifted slightly, and Tom had the uncomfortable feeling that his name was familiar to her in ways that suggested he'd been a topic of conversation. She picked up her phone and spoke quietly for a moment, then hung up with a smile that looked both sympathetic and encouraging. "She'll see you," the receptionist said, pointing toward a hallway lined with photographs of families and children that Tom recognized as the kind of success stories non-profits used to illustrate their impact. "Third door on the right. And Mr. Hayes?" She looked at him with the kind of direct attention that suggested she had something important to say. "She's been hoping you'd come." The words gave him courage, even as they made him feel guilty for waiting so long to swallow his pride. Tom found Maggie's office door slightly ajar, and through the opening, he could see her sitting at a desk covered with grant applications and medical bills that people like him had submitted when they'd run out of other options. She looked up when he knocked, and her face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, hope, caution, and something that might have been joy before she settled on carefully neutral professionalism. "Tom," she said, standing up with the kind of formal politeness that felt like a wall between them. "Please come in." The office was smaller than he'd expected, but warm, filled with thank-you letters from families and children's artwork that covered every available surface. Tom recognized Grace's painting style in several of the pieces and realized that Maggie had been displaying his daughter's work alongside the creations of dozens of other children whose lives she'd touched. The gesture was so quietly caring that Tom felt his carefully prepared speech dissolve into something more honest and immediate. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out in a rush before he could second-guess them. "About everything. About you, about Anna, about what happened between us." Maggie sat back down, but her posture remained careful, as if she was preparing herself for another round of accusations and dismissals. "Grace is miserable, and I'm miserable, and I think I made the biggest mistake of my life when I asked you to leave." The admission cost him something, stripped away the protective anger that had been keeping him warm for weeks. Maggie was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the kind of attention that made Tom feel exposed and hopeful in equal measure. "Anna didn't send me to fix you," she said finally, her voice soft but clear. "She asked me to check on you, to make sure you and Grace were okay, but everything else, everything we built together, That was real, Tom. That was us choosing each other, not following some script she left behind. She paused, and Tom could see her gathering courage for something difficult. But I should have told you the truth from the beginning. I was scared that if you knew about my connection to Anna, you'd see me as an obligation instead of a choice, and I should have trusted that what we had was strong enough to survive the truth. Tom replied, taking a step closer to her desk. Anna knew me better than I knew myself. She knew I'd be too proud to accept help directly, too scared to let someone new into our lives intentionally. So she gave us a chance to find each other naturally, and I threw it away the moment I felt vulnerable. The words felt like confession, and forgiveness rolled into one, acknowledging his failures while celebrating Anna's wisdom in ways he'd been too angry to recognize before. Maggie stood up again, and this time there was nothing careful or professional about her movement. Grace asked me something the last time I saw her, she said, moving around the desk to stand directly in front of him. She asked if I thought Anna was lonely in heaven, or if she was happy that the people she loved were taking care of each other. Tom felt his breath catch at the question, recognizing his daughter's unique ability to cut straight to the heart of complicated emotional landscapes with devastating simplicity. "What did you tell her?" Tom asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the way Maggie was looking at him. "I told her that Anna sent me to love you both because she knew that love multiplies instead of dividing, that caring for her family wouldn't take anything away from what I felt for her." Maggie reached out tentatively, and when Tom didn't pull away, she took his hands in hers. "I told her that sometimes the best way to honor someone who's gone is to keep loving the people they left behind." Tom looked down at their joined hands and saw the calluses he'd noticed that first day at the coffee shop, evidence of work and care that he'd been too suspicious to investigate. "What are these from?" he asked, running his thumb over the rough spots on her fingers. Maggie smiled, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked genuinely relaxed. "I teach art classes here twice a week for kids whose families are dealing with medical crises. Turns out wealthy widows can have hidden talents." The revelation was so perfectly aligned with everything Tom had thought he wanted in a partner that he had to laugh at his own blindness. "Grace was right," he said, pulling Maggie closer until she was standing within the circle of his arms. "We were all being stupid, missing each other when we could have been together." Maggie leaned into him with a sigh that sounded like coming home, and Tom realized that this was what Anna had envisioned when she'd asked her friend to watch over her family. Not replacement or substitution, but addition and expansion. Love that honored what came before while embracing what could come next. They talked until well past midnight, sitting on the floor of Maggie's office surrounded by children's artwork and grant applications, sharing stories about Anna that Tom had never heard, and memories about loss that Maggie had never voiced. Tom learned that Anna had worried most about Grace growing up without female guidance, that she'd spent hours describing their daughter's personality to Maggie so that someone would know how to nurture Grace's specific gifts. Maggie learned that Tom's reluctance to paint had less to do with grief than with fear that creating beauty without Anna felt like betrayal, that he'd been afraid his art would somehow diminish her memory. "She made me promise something," Maggie said as they finally prepared to leave the building together. "Anna made me promise that if you and Grace ever learned to love me, I wouldn't let guilt about her stop me from loving you back completely." Tom felt something settle in his chest that had been restless since the night Anna died, a peace that came from understanding that healing didn't require forgetting, that moving forward could honor the past instead of abandoning it. 6 months later, Tom stood in the art classroom that had become his and Maggie's shared workspace, watching Grace teach a younger child how to mix colors, while Maggie worked with a teenager whose parents were fighting cancer together. The Whitfield Foundation had expanded its programming to include art therapy for families in crisis and Tom had taken a part-time position that allowed him to combine his teaching skills with his understanding of what children needed when their worlds were falling apart. Grace, now 8 and wiser than her years suggested possible, had adapted to their new family structure with the resilience that children display when the adults around them are genuinely happy. She called Maggie Mom Maggie to distinguish her from Mom Anna, a designation that had initially worried Tom until he realized that Grace's heart was simply large enough to hold multiple versions of love simultaneously. The art room had become a gallery of Grace's work, charting her emotional development through colors and shapes that grew more confident with each passing month. The watercolor box that had started everything sat in a place of honor on the windowsill, its worn wood and paint-stained compartments serving as a bridge between past and present. Tom had finally opened it completely, discovering not just Anna's paints, but also letters she'd written to Grace for future birthdays, photographs of their early days together, and a note addressed to whoever helps Tom learn to love again, that had made him cry for an hour when he'd found it. Anna's presence in their new life wasn't intrusive or competitive, it was foundational, the bedrock upon which they'd built something beautiful and sustainable. On quiet evenings when Grace was asleep, and the house felt full rather than empty, Tom and Maggie would sit together, planning lessons for their shared classes or reviewing applications from families who needed the kind of help Tom had been too proud to ask for 18 months earlier. Sometimes they talked about Anna, sharing memories that kept her alive in their conversations without making her a ghost that haunted their happiness. Sometimes they planned their own future, discussing the possibility of marriage with the careful attention of people who understood that love was both precious and fragile, deserving of patience and intention. The biggest surprise had been how naturally they'd all fit together, how easily their individual lives had merged into something that felt both inevitable and miraculous. Tom's art had returned with a vengeance, informed now by loss and recovery in ways that made his teaching more effective and his personal work more meaningful. Maggie had found in their family the sense of purpose that had been missing from her charity work, the feeling that her efforts were personal rather than professional. And Grace had blossomed under the attention of 2 adults who loved her unconditionally, while also loving each other in ways that made their household feel secure rather than fragile. On the anniversary of Anna's death, the 3 of them visited her grave together, bringing flowers and new paintings and stories about how their family had grown in ways Anna would have approved of. Tom no longer felt guilty about his happiness, understanding finally that Anna's love had been generous enough to encompass his future as well as their past. Grace chattered to her mother's headstone about school and art and the new baby ducks at the park, treating death as a change in location rather than an ending of relationship. As they walked back to the car, Grace skipping ahead while Tom and Maggie followed hand in hand, Tom realized that Anna had given them the most precious gift imaginable: the courage to love again without reservation, the wisdom to build new happiness without destroying old memories, and the understanding that families could expand and evolve without losing their essential character. The emergency room where they'd first met felt like a lifetime ago, but Tom could still remember the exact moment when Maggie had recognized Anna's paint box and spoken his wife's name with the familiarity of someone who had earned the right to remember her out loud. In the growing dusk of a Millbrook evening, walking toward a future that held promise instead of just survival, Tom understood that some stories don't end with loss, but begin with it, using grief as a foundation for joy that runs deeper because it acknowledges the cost of loving fully. Grace's laughter echoed off the cemetery walls like music, and Maggie's hand in his felt like coming home to a place he'd never known existed. Anna's gift to them hadn't been a replacement for what they'd lost, but an expansion of what they'd thought possible. Love that multiplied instead of diminished, hope that grew stronger because it had been tested by the worst life could offer. The paint box sat safely in Grace's backpack, no longer a relic of the past, but a tool for creating futures Anna could only have dreamed of, colors mixed with intention and applied with the confidence that comes from understanding that beauty is not diminished by sadness but made more precious because of it. The last visitors departed as darkness settled over the city, leaving the gallery space peaceful and warm in the glow of carefully positioned lighting that accommodated various sensory processing needs. Ruby had fallen asleep curled up next to her latest color study, while Jasper continued working on mathematical calculations for their next collaborative project. Zoe was reading quietly in a corner, occasionally looking up to observe the comfortable domesticity of their unconventional family gathering. Helena began the gentle process of transitioning the children toward home and bedtime routines, her movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to create structure without rigidity, accommodation without chaos. Benjamin gathered art supplies and turned off equipment, his hands moving through familiar patterns that had become meditative rather than merely functional. As they prepared to leave the gallery space that had become the visible symbol of their commitment to honoring neurodivergent gifts, Benjamin paused to look once more at the children's collaborative installation. The piece seemed to pulse with its own internal light, geometric patterns and flowing colors, creating a visual representation of minds working together in harmony rather than competition. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: funding applications and research collaborations, therapeutic sessions with children whose gifts hadn't yet been recognized, conversations with educators and parents who were beginning to understand that different didn't necessarily mean deficient. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet evidence of healing and creativity and love that had emerged from their willingness to risk authentic connection, Benjamin Mitchell felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd finally learned to stop hiding from his own gifts and the people who needed them most. The drive home through the quiet city streets was filled with the comfortable silence of a family that had learned to communicate through presence as much as words, their different ways of processing and expressing emotion woven together into something resilient and beautiful and entirely their own. And in the peaceful breathing of children who finally felt safe enough to sleep deeply, Benjamin could hear the echo of Luna's voice, reminding him that the most important art was always the kind that helped other people remember they weren't alone in the world.